Up until this point, we've discussed how we can create web pages using HTML. But what if we don't have access to our data until we make a request? We can use JavaScript to dynamically generate DOM nodes once we have the data we need. For example, let's go back to our social card example from the nesting elements video. We know the HTML elements that we'll need to create the social cards, but we don't have the data that we need. Let's simulate this in JavaScript with data represented in an array of objects. Each object has a name, city, country, and avatar image. This is the HTML we want to create for each user. So how do we go about creating these elements? First, we'll want to iterate over each user and generate nodes for each piece of information. For this, we'll use a for each loop. Now, let's start from the outermost node, in this case, the div that wraps our social card, and work our way inward and downward. We can create a new DOM node using document.createElement. Inside of the parentheses, we pass the HTML tag name that we want to instantiate. In our case, this is a div. Since this course doesn't focus on styling, I'm going to add a black border to each div node to help break things up visually. I can set the style using the style property on the div we just created. The next element in the markup is the avatar image. We can create the image node in the same way we created the div node, with document.createElement. The image element had some additional attributes that we need to set. For example, the source and the alt text. We can set these attributes directly on the node we just created and assign them to the desired values. In this case, the source will be the user's avatar value, and the alt text will be the user's name. Now we have two nodes, the wrapping div and the avatar image. How do we know that this is working? How do we get this to render in the browser? To do this, we need to append these nodes to the DOM tree to make them appear. First, let's append the avatar image to the div wrapper. To do this, we can use the appendChild function. We still haven't appended the wrapper node to anything in the DOM, so let's do that now. We can see that we have a div with a class of wrapper in the HTML. We can get a handle on this node and append our social wrapper element. Then, our 4 cards with avatars will be rendered in the browser. To get a handle on a node in an HTML file, we can use a few different methods. Document.getElementById, document.getElementsByClassName, document.querySelector, and document.querySelectorAll. getElementById takes one argument, the ID of the HTML element we want to get a handle on. getElementsByClassName takes one argument as well, the class name of the HTML elements we want to get a handle on. The difference between getElementById and getElementsByClassName is that getElementsByClassName returns a node list with 0 or more elements, while getElementById returns 1 element. This is because IDs should be unique and only assigned to one element, while classes can be added to many different elements. querySelector and querySelectorAll work very similarly to getElementById and getElementsByClassName. The primary difference is that you must pass in the hash symbol in front of an ID or the period symbol in front of a class name to indicate which type of attribute you're searching for. As you might be able to deduce by the name, querySelector returns the first element that matches the argument, while querySelectorAll will return a node list with 0 or more matches. For this exercise, I'll stick with querySelector, as I'm only looking for one node. I'll place this variable outside my for each loop so it can be instantiated once and referenced within the loop. Now we can append the social wrapper to the wrapper and see our results. Great! Now let's add the name, location, and button to each social card. The process is very similar to what we've just done. For the name, we'll create an h3 element. Instead of directly appending the text content to the node, or setting it with innerHTML, it's important to use innerText or textContent to display this data. This prevents cross-site scripting attacks or other security vulnerabilities. At a high level, textContent gets the content of all elements, including the script and style tags, whereas innerText gets the text from human-readable elements. I won't dive into the differences between innerText and textContent here. You can check out this great article on Mozilla Developer Network to learn more. You can also use document.createText node to work with data, but it's a bit more verbose. So for this exercise, we'll stick with innerText. Location is a bit trickier because we have a nested link node wrapping the city name. So first, we'll create the paragraph node, and we can set the innerText to the country name. Now let's create the city link. We can set the source to a hash symbol for now, since this is just a demo. Let's demonstrate how I can use createText node to add the city name and a comma. Inside the appendChild function, we can create a new text node. I'll then use a template string to add the user's city, followed by a comma and a space. Now we need to add the city node to the location node, but we want it to come before the innerText. So to do this, we can use the prepend method and pass it the city node. This will prepend the node before the innerText. Lastly, let's add the button to the social card. This is the same process as above, but instead of using appendChild to add the button node to the social wrapper, we'll just use append. Append and prepend allow us to append string objects as well as nodes. And now we have 4 dynamically generated social cards. While it's a tedious process, it's an important one. So make sure you're comfortable dynamically generating DOM nodes.